So the other day, I was listening to what I think was the Shop Talk show with Chris Coyier and Dave Rupert, and they mentioned the target CSS pseudo-class. And I've been doing CSS for a long time, and I never heard of the target selector, so I wanted to look into it. Apparently, what it does is it allows us to style an element whose ID attribute, matches the current URL fragment or the URL hash. And what we can do is use that selection to conditionally show and hide an element or style an element based on the URL. So what I wanted to do was take my previous timeline demo, which I had implemented in Angular, more as a reason to explore position sticky in a horizontal plane. But now what I wanted to do is actually use the target CSS pseudo-class to hide and then show elements based on the URL. So as we click into the timeline here, what you can see is that I have this fragment 12 Edna Young, and on the right here you can see that I'm showing Edna Young's detail. And if I close, what you'll see is that this hash is going to disappear, and when the hash disappears, we get the call to action for clicking on the timeline. Now if I open up the console and we look over at the call to action and we look at the elements, what we can see is that we have our call to action with display block, but then above it we have all of our user details. And let's see, let's jump up to the top here to the first one. We can see Elena Rodriguez, and we can see that the display here is none. But now if I click into this timeline element, what you'll see is that we get Elena being displayed, and that's because, I don't know why the CSS isn't working here. There we go. Then that's because if we have a user that matches the target CSS selector, one Elena Rodriguez, we can see that's one Elena Rodriguez. So the URL fragment, the URL hash here matches the ID. In that case, we're going to change that from display none to display block. But you'll also see that our call to action is gone. So how is our call to action gone? Well, if we jump all the way to the bottom, we click into the call to action, what we can see is that while the default is display block, we're going to be using the general sibling combinator to say that any call to action element that follows a targeted user element, because they're all in the same parent container, we're then going to switch that to display none, which is why when we close this, let's click out and click back in, we can see we go back to display block showing the call to action because the call to action is no longer following a targeted user element. So that's pretty cool. I mean, typically when I wanted to create a page like this, right, I would reach for JavaScript, I would reach more specifically for Angular, but it's nice to know that we can actually create an interactive, rich experience, sometimes using just CSS, and in this case, using just the URL fragments here that match the particular elements, again, using that target, that target CSS pseudo-class. I'm not going to bother really going into how this is laid out. All to say that, again, here we have our user, which is all the users are displaying none by default. The call to action is displaying block, meaning it's being shown by default. Then if the user is being targeted, meaning the user ID matches the URL fragment, we're going to display that user. And then we're going to hide the call to action if it follows a targeted user. So anytime a user element matches the URL fragment, we're going to hide that call to action, which is why we only get a mutually exclusive relationship here between the user detail and the call to action. Click back in, we get the user detail, but no call to action. And then you can review this on your own. Essentially here, we're just looping over some user data, each element in this timeline. So each horizontal track here represents a user. The href here points to the user ID or the track ID. That's why the URL fragment is being changed, because we're just using a hash-based URL. And then this track ID, when we output the details, and you'll see that we're outputting all the details on the page at one time. We're just defaulting most of them to being hidden, but then each user detail gets an ID that matches that track ID. So again, when the URL fragment changes to contain the track, we're able to target this element using that target target CSS pseudo-class. So anyway, you know, if this demo needed to get richer. For example, right now I'm showing the user detail, but I'm not keeping the row highlighted. If I wanted to keep the row highlighted, now we're getting past what I think we can do with general CSS. We probably have to sprinkle in a little JavaScript here to, maybe add an event listener to the window hash change event and start selecting some stuff, removing classes. But for very basic stuff here, you can see that we're actually able to create, again, that fairly rich experience using just this CSS target pseudo class. So pretty cool. I had never heard of it. I wanted to try it out, and having that in my back pocket, I feel like that's gonna be useful.